Hey there, A-Push learners. Today we're talking a little bit more about the colonies. If you're following through, we've covered period 1. We're now into period 2 in English colonization. Your brochures and pamphlets have been carefully crafted, and now you've also had the opportunity to see and look at others and kind of compare across. Today's discussion is going to be an extension of what you learned when making your brochures and then comparing them to others. It's also an extension of the summer assignment when you completed the colonies chart and kind of compared and contrast the different environments and patterns of colonization there. So today's, what we're talking about, should just kind of be punctuation upon those things which you already know. It's just kind of a little bit of glancing on some of these colonies because you've already done a lot with them. It is not important that you know an extensive amount about each colony, but what we're looking for is patterns in English settlement and patterns in comparing that to Spanish settlement and just kind of differences based on climate, occupation, different things like that. So that's what we're looking to get to today. Again, I'm just going to glance on some of the colonies. I'm going to refer you to a couple of videos that you're going to see there in your Google Classroom assignment, and then we'll kind of go from there. So let's go ahead and bring up this. As we talk about the colonies and some important tidbits and things that you might want to know, or you may already know if it were one of the colonies on your brochure. Again, we want a good knowledge and sampling of patterns within the colonies. And so some of the things we're going to look at and probably hit some of the more important or popular ones. For the point of comparison, I want to talk about our Spanish colonies. I know we've sort of moved on from Spanish colonization. We talked about that a little bit earlier. But again, we're looking at English colonization today, so let's take a step back and remember what the Spanish tribute colonies look a little bit like. To start with, what I want to do here is I want you to answer the following question based on what you know already about Spanish colonies and now what you know about English colonies after having completed your brochure and the gallery walk and the summer assignment chart that you did comparing colonies. So I would ask you this: how do Spanish colonies or Spanish settlements compare to that of English colonies? So what are some of the similarities and differences between these two patterns of settlement? Go ahead and answer that now. Okay. Depending on what route you went, you could have found several similarities or differences. There are some pretty stark differences, I think, in general. First, the encomienda system that we talked about earlier is much different than our English pattern of settlement. The wealth is concentrated in the hands of very few. Remember, this is kind of like plantation vacation for our Spanish settlers. They're not thinking, let's get a whole bunch of white settlers all up in here and have like a city of people and lots of industry and things like that. That's not what they want. They want their big old encomienda where they can have their land and their slaves and everything else like that. And they can kind of spread out. It can be their own little tropical paradise of sorts. What they don't want is crowded settlement. This is kind of more of a selfish kind of vacation sort of deal for them, where they're making their own luxury home. All right. So that wealth is concentrated in the hands of a select few, and population is relatively low among the white settlers. Keep in mind that when we're talking about an encomienda, it is a plot of land, but everything that is on that land is part of the encomienda, whether it's the labor, that would be natives that live on the land, whether it be the resources. Granted, we understand that the King of Spain has absolutely no right to give away, well, first off, the land to be in general, but certainly not the people that live on it or anything else like that. But he does, and that's what an encomienda is. It kind of gives you a little insight on what these people that settle, the Spanish that settle in these areas, kind of what their interests are. You know, it's wealth, it's sprawling tracts of land, it's all that kind of stuff. Right? That probably differs quite a bit from what you saw in English colonization. Even early English colonization, most of it's not plantation labor. In some places it's beginning to develop, and certainly in the Caribbean and other things. But for the most part, it's not to this scale, and the settlement patterns are a little bit different. Another important part of this is the caste system that develops in the Spanish tribute colonies. And it's really interesting because not only do you have Spanish settlers, but when we have Native Americans that are going to be enslaved, when you bring in African slaves, you get all of you of course have white Spaniards at the top of this caste system, but then you've got all sorts of different mixed races like mestizos and mulattoes and different things like that. And so you get this very rigid caste system. So it's worth thinking about, what are the long-term effects of such a complicated, rigid social system? I mean, this reverberates not just in Spanish colonization. It's going to reverberate and have a ripple effect beyond just the Spanish colonies. It's going to have a reverberation, a ripple effect beyond just the 1500s. So when we think long-term and wide-reaching, what impact does the caste system have? Well, we're talking about institutionalized race-based slavery that's introduced here. You know, we go back and we talk about, and people often think about slavery in the South and how that introduces race-based slavery in the Americas. Not really. It actually starts here. And the social, kind of the official political social structure that this establishes based on race really sets a standard and a pattern in the New World. As we've discussed before, at least I think as we've mentioned, Spain is going to be sunk because of this. And nobody would have ever seen it coming, because you figure there can't be too much of a good thing. Well, there is. There's too much of a good thing. Too much gold is bad, just like anything else. What gives something its value? It's usually its rarity, and that's what had made gold so special a currency in the world. Everybody wanted gold because it was rare. It was hard to get. It was good currency. But when there's just a massive influx of gold into the Spanish economy, and the more and more and more and more that comes into it, just like supply and demand and all of that, the more available that supply is, the less value it holds. And with this great influx of gold, the value of it deteriorates greatly among the Spanish, and it sinks the entire economy. And when that happens, and when that goes down in starting going down in the 1600s and then continues to evolve throughout the 1700s and 1800s, it's all because that greed, which they had thought was going to make them wealthy beyond measure, kind of backfires and helps sink their economy in the end. So that's our kind of pattern with Spanish tribute colonies. Compare to English, and we're going to start with the first and most basic of those, and that in Jamestown. What I want to do here is I'm going to take a pause, and there's a video in your in this assignment that I want you to click on. It says, I think you call it like Jamestown, or I don't know. You'll be able to see it. It's the first video, and what the very first and most important question is, why does Jamestown fail? And by the way, it barely survives, and it scrapes by and finally turns into Virginia colony. I guess it does make it, but I think most people would look at Jamestown initially and say, this was a pretty bad failure. You guys know what happened. It was a terrible, terrible time just to even surviving the first year there, and all kinds of disease and tragedy and cannibalism and all kinds of weird things. It just didn't work out. Why? And so I want you to watch this video, and by the way, probably not perfectly factual at all, but, and it's so familiar to you and you know it and you've seen this before, but the story that they're telling is kind of true. And if you're looking for the reason of why Jamestown did not succeed, you can find it in this video. So watch this video and then come back and tell me why it failed. Okay. Hopefully you're able to come up with it. And again, this is the watered down Disney version, but it actually is pretty close, or at least hints at some part of the truth. Keep in mind, Jamestown it's a joint stock company of people that are investing, that are wanting to become rich. These are not the kinds of people that you want to go camping with. These are people that have lived a life of relative wealth, not exactly your backwoodsy type. And so they sail across the ocean here and come and land at Jamestown, where, by the way, there is nothing. There is nothing in Virginia. It is unsettled land, and there's no general store. There's nothing. And so these people who go off and expect to walk off the boat and trip over gold, and certainly that doesn't happen, they're kind of not getting what they expected. And so when stuck in this land that is not hospitable at all, that they waste all of their time searching for gold, that they don't plant and they don't farm, that they don't prepare for the winter because they're foolishly chasing around gold, they're not going to make it. There's no question they're not going to make it because they haven't done what it takes to survive in wilderness instead of been looking for gold all the time. And maybe wouldn't have been very well equipped to survive in the wilderness anyway because they're the kind of more wealthy, hoity-toity kind of types. So why does it fail? Well, it's just the wrong type of people to go out and blaze a new trail in America of unsettled land and colonize. These are wealthy elites that are not used to working very hard for themselves, and this is not the kind of work for them that it takes to colonize. To further that, and what was really demonstrated in the video, is that they're going to focus really only on the pursuit of collecting gold. Very little effort made towards settlement, a lot made towards getting rich. And when there's not much or a whole lot of gold to find, and you spend all your time looking for it, you're going to find yourself vastly unprepared for that which you're about to face. Didn't plant crops. They didn't do anything that was going to sustain life for an extended amount of time. Again, foolishly, because they're thinking only about wealth and accumulation of wealth. When disease hits, they're extremely unprepared to weather that storm, of course. And listen, you've got like one possible friend there that could maybe help you out because there are people that are there that know the lay of the land, that know how to survive in the wilderness, and you can't even make peace with them. And you're constantly bickering back and forth and ending up in fights with those because, well, again, you're Eurocentric, I got that white man's burden kind of feeling to it, and that only ends up in conflict. So the only people there that could actually help you, you kind of burn that bridge as well. Why does it fail, or why does it nearly go into extinction? Because they go about it in every possible wrong way. Now, one thing does save it, and that is tobacco. And this is entirely pretty much the guy behind this is John Rolfe. And this is the good John, right? So we know the story of Pocahontas, which, by the way, if you haven't kind of gathered by this point or through your reading or anything else like that, is kind of a whole big lie. Pocahontas knew John Smith as far as we can tell. You know, they had familiarity with one another. There's no real evidence of a romantic relationship that was just kind of left as a cliffhanger at the end of the Disney movie. But they did know each other. There was an age gap of like 20 years. And look up a picture of John Smith and just tell me if he looks anything like the guy in the movie. Not exactly maybe what you were expecting. But nevertheless, all of that aside, the real husband of the real husband of Pocahontas, the one that is going to show up in Pocahontas 2, for those of you that stuck around for the VHS sequel, John Rolfe comes and introduces tobacco, which was actually kind of a risky venture because it wasn't easy to get your hands on tobacco at the time. Spain controlled that trade, but introduces that into Virginia, which was a great environment for growing tobacco. And as such, and given the fact that England is already quite addicted, this becomes the thing that will save Virginia and allow them to prosper eventually. It has its advantages, it has its disadvantages. It's obviously a constant supply to England because it's addictive, and so it's a great cash crop. On the other hand, it's pretty labor intensive, and as you've noticed that many of the European settlers are not really super into labor, so there's that. And it's going to introduce, of course, then indentured servitude and then eventually slavery as well into the colonies as they work through tobacco. The other thing is it's going to get to that point where overproduction of tobacco ruins the value. So it's good, but it's good for a short time. Finally, after 1622, after the Indian War that takes place there, it becomes very clear to the king that the white settlers that he's put in place there are incapable of really maintaining peace and using the colony for efficient economic benefits when they're constantly at war with the Indians and can't keep the peace. So Virginia and Jamestown are basically taken back by the king, and they become a royal colony instead of a joint stock company, an investment for those investors in the end. And that pattern of royal control and switching back and forth between somewhat quasi-independence and royal control is going to be a theme that we visit later. Jamestown, where we eat people. All right, so that takes us to a completely different model, one that maybe more than any reflects what's going on in the Spanish colonies, and that's the Caribbean or plantation colonies. You see this primarily in the islands because of their hospitable climate for growing things such as sugar and tobacco as cash crops. Large plots of land, perfect climate for it, easy to get labor and slaves there, and so this becomes the mold that you saw in some of the islands off the coast of Africa. This will be great. These will be great environments for sugar and tobacco growth and profiteering. So it's set up in much the same pattern as some of the encomiendas and things like that, where we're not trying to flood these islands with lots of white settlement. Instead, it's there to produce cash crops. They start as smaller, many of these colonies start as smaller freeholds, where families had 30 to 50 acres. But what you see happening is wealthy, ambitious, plantation-minded gentry start to collect freeholds and try to combine them and turn them into much, much larger, powerful plantations. And those freeholds, which are kind of more essentially like family farms, go by the wayside and become marginalized more and more as they become a plantation-based economy in these places. Combine that with this idea of a headright system where land was granted to people if they were willing to pay passage for indentured servants, and they were given land grants if they would bring more servants and more laborers across. That just allowed these wealthy to accumulate more and more land and kind of killed off the family farm, the smaller farms, and made it completely a plantation-based economy. So then you have the issue of labor. You got options, right? You've got, in some places, the natives, which we know very quickly are wiped out or almost wiped out, so that isn't a very sustainable source of labor. Then you've got the indentured servitude. And indentured servitude is an interesting thing we'll talk about a little bit later in the Virginia colonies as they develop. But indentured servitude seems like a pretty good deal. Work under a service contract. When you get to the end of that, you get some land. But here's the deal. Indentured servitude was not that sustainable. It cost a little bit more money in the end, and it became a harder sell, because what happened is a lot of these indentured servants, they came over, they might last a year or so before they kind of keeled over dead. Different environment, not really prepared for it, not prepared for labor. By the way, indentured servants also beat by their masters and things like that, so it's not really exactly this great gig anyway. But it becomes a little bit expensive. Your other option, of course, is slavery. Now, slavery is a little bit more affordable. Slaves are cheaper, receive even worse treatment. Don't have to take quite as good care of them as you justify through race-based slavery. And so that's also the other option on the table. So the question is, with all of this, why do we go from, indentured servitude and people working the farm? Why the slavery that we know? Why the harsh treatment? Well, think about the dynamic on the Caribbean or these plantation economies. It's like a couple white guys that are in charge of the plantations, and then hundreds, if not thousands, of slaves. The harsh treatment, the guns, the beating, the whipping, and everything, all of that is, and I use in quotations, necessary, right? All of that comes in as part of it to try to maintain that balance of power. Think about this dynamic. Thousands of slaves, very few white people. The threat of revolt, the threat of rebellion is constantly there. And so that violence, that fear kind of leadership is what is put in place to try to maintain the balance of power that's there. Otherwise, thinking about it, slaves could overthrow this thing very, very quickly. And so that harsh treatment is the response to try to maintain that power and that imbalance in numbers. Eventually, we see this all become slave labor because indentured servitude is just too daggone expensive. People were dying too fast. And so slaves were much, much more, it was cheaper and more efficient for one of them to die off after you work them literally to death. More economical than trying to kind of, I don't know if take care is really, but just sort of maintain indentured servants. And so as far as the economy goes of a plantation, slave labor was much, much more economical. It didn't have all the kind of difficulties and really honestly, the complications of indentured servitude. And so that shift happens. And also, indentured servitude, the supply wasn't enough. As these plantations grow, there's just not enough that are willing to take on that. So that's our Caribbean or plantation economies. So let's shift to our last big one that we're going to talk about. That's our Massachusetts Bay Colony. And you know some of the story behind this, although there's something that we constantly or pretty constantly confuse. And that's the difference between Puritans and Pilgrims. Our first ones there, and there is a difference, by the way, and we need to be able to kind of tell the difference. Our first ones there are Plymouth Rockers, those ones that, you know, get on the Mayflower and come across, and we have wonderful Snoopy cartoons about. Their Pilgrims are Pilgrims. The Pilgrims are really separatists from the Church of England. They have been mistreated. They disagree with what's going on in the Church of England. They went to Holland for some time, and now they fled to America, and they have desired to completely separate from the church. Those are our Mayflowers. Those are the ones at Plymouth. Later, we have a different group. The second group is called our Puritans. All right, our Puritans are a little bit different. Their goal, they have problems with the church. They're not quite exiled like our Pilgrims are, and they are not separatists. They instead believe they're going to reform the Church of England in America. I mean, obviously that creates a little bit of a problem because it is called the Church of England and you are living in America, and so that is kind of a strange theory, but they're trying to purify that church, hence the name Puritans. They do not separate from the church. They're trying to make it better. They come across, and they're led by people like John Winthrop, and they land in a little bit north of where Plymouth is, and they establish what is known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so slight differences here. Pilgrims are separatists. Puritans are purifying or reforming the church. Our Pilgrims are the Mayflower folks, okay, and the Mayflower Compact and all that. We'll talk about our Puritans, and what they're about is just a little bit different, okay? Our Pilgrims are, by the way, and this is pretty important to our discussion, much more religiously tolerant than our Puritans are. That's a key to all of this. We know some of the essential documents that are born out of both of theirs. Our first group, the Pilgrims, bring us the Mayflower Compact, because as they're coming across, they're like, wait a minute, when we step off this boat, this could get crazy. So we ought to have some kind of a formal recognition that we're going to work this in a logical way, and we're going to organize ourselves and have some sort of organized way about this. This is kind of the beginnings of representative government, sort of, in the United States or in the Americas. And so that's why we recognize and say, well, the Mayflower Compact, that was a big deal. It's kind of the seedlings of American government. And that's probably true. The essential thing that we know from our second group, the Puritans, is called the city upon a hill. And we're going to look at that in more detail at the end of this lesson as you kind of break down that document. But John Winthrop gives a speech on his way over on the boat and says, okay, here are the principles that are going to make us successful in the New World. Now, these groups are a little bit different in the way they approach things. Our Puritans become best known for what establishes the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And if you did your reading and you did your comparison, you know this is a very religiously intolerant group. There's it's almost like a little bit of, we've got representative government, but it's almost theocratic in some ways. And so so there's not a lot of religious tolerance that goes on there. The Puritan state sort of controls things, and that's where it gets most of its reputation. So there are people that come along, like Roger Williams, who's like, you know what, maybe we should be a little bit more religiously tolerant. He's a Puritan minister, but that is not a very Puritan idea. And so people are like, no, sir. And speaking of it, we know there's so many different interesting Puritan laws that codified church beliefs into common law. And certainly speaking that in such a way, Roger Williams was doing, is not okay. And so, by the way, Roger Williams is also like, hey, maybe we should be nice to the Indians. And like, this is crazy. Get this guy out of here. So they kick him out, and he's like, fine, I'm leaving. He goes to Rhode Island and establishes his own religiously tolerant colony of Rhode Island, and just kind of out and apart from the core of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So that leads to further settlement in Rhode Island. And then you've got another well-known outcast from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and that's Anne Hutchinson, who was pontificating on some different doctrines from what the Puritan Church was teaching at the time in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And, well, yeah, she's a woman too, and that doesn't really, women in Puritan kind of Calvinist background don't really have a whole lot of standing in the church. So the fact that she's trying to shape doctrine is somewhat offensive to many Puritan leaders, and so they also kick her out. And she's like, hey, here Rhode Island's great this time of year, and she heads out as well. Just kind of gives you an idea of the dynamic of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in general. We do learn a couple things from Massachusetts Bay, probably none more prominent than the story we get from the witch trials. If there's anything that tells you that you're maybe a little bit over the top with your religious intolerance and the way your laws are set up and just generally how you're running society, it's probably that, where anybody who kind of looks at you the wrong way or is wearing the wrong color or just kind of smells funny might be a witch, and we're going to hang them. So there's something to be taken away from this. We have colonies that are based primarily on accumulating wealth. That didn't turn out well. We've got colonies that are based entirely on enforcing their religion. We see that this that's a little bit over the top as well. So I'm not going to expound a ton on the witch trials. You kind of know the story behind that. But I think that there's definitely something here that we can learn about English settlement and patterns here. That there's a lesson to be learned there. One lesser known lesson, though, it has to do with the way they set up society, and they break up the land. There's not huge plantations, unlike you will see in the South or even the Chesapeake area. Instead, they break the land up and kind of like anti-feudalism style. Thinking about what happened under English feudalism, they're like, wait a minute, we don't want that to happen. Every family, everybody gets some land. That doesn't mean there was equality. That doesn't mean everybody's got the best land, and there's definitely some favoritism in how that land is distributed sometimes. But everybody kind of gets their own little plot of land and their own little chance to make it. That's a model that is going to not always be repeated here in the early colonies, but has some sense to it. Because then everybody who owns a little bit of land also gets a say in the government. Now we're talking about representative government, so there's some really good ideas being planted there, aside from the religious fanaticism that's taking place. Those are our big ones. With what's left, we're just going to hit some real quick greatest hits. New France is such an interesting place in the fact that, well, just in the sense of they get along with the natives, which is unique to them. They've got this awesome fur trade. There's a lot of missionary work going on among the Indians. But listen, it's not an inviting place. The French themselves really aren't that welcoming to new groups and new people coming in there. They're really liking to try to stay private, keep their own land to themselves. And, the climate up there, it's most of New France is actually Canada. So nothing wrong with Canadians or anything. It's just that it's not the best climate in the world for a lot of people. So, I mean, in some ways, New France doesn't appeal to a whole lot of people. New Netherlands is kind of in a similar climate band. It's a little bit further south. As you know, that's going to later develop into the land known as New York. They've also got a great fur trade there. There's some attempts at agriculture. This is kind of a half effort at settlement. They run into all kinds of Indian troubles in the New Netherlands and can never quite work that out until the Dutch are going to give quite a bit of this over to the English eventually. Maryland's a really interesting place because that's established as a safe haven for Catholics who have been persecuted in different parts in Europe and particularly England. And so it's based on religion. This kind of see some similarities and patterns of settlement here, and eventually becomes tolerant of all religions. So it's an interesting hybrid of Maryland becomes this the start of settlement for religious freedom. Also, it's developing at the same time this unique Chesapeake Bay kind of economy with the growth of tobacco and different things like that. So it's kind of got a little bit of a blend of a number of the different things that we've talked about thus far. Pennsylvania didn't make the cut on this one. It's a restoration colony. We'll talk about it a little bit later. So if that was your brochure topic, don't worry, some other day. But you kind of get the idea here. What you're looking for is some of the outstanding characteristics of these colonies and what you see, how you think, or how the English think that settlement's going to go, and how that compares to what they actually end up with. What some of the goals of settlement are. You can see that in a couple different places. When they get here, what the reality of that situation is. Different objectives, different ideas, different climates create different ways of living. You saw that through your brochure comparison, but you see some constant themes throughout, whether it's motivation, whether it's Indian relations, whether it's just even how they set up their economies and agriculture and develop. You see some similarities and patterns and differences as there as well. So our closure activity today is going to have you examine one of the documents I referred to earlier. It's a model of Christian charity, sometimes known as the City on a Hill speech by John Winthrop. It's going to have you answer a couple questions on that document and kind of analyze it and break it apart a little bit. But that should give us kind of a basis on where we're going with our colonies and give you some extra little tidbits to focus on as far as why they might be important to our larger narrative of colonization. Hope that helps. Hope that kind of supplements what you learned with your brochures and your chart, and you have a pretty good understanding of what English colonization looked like. Until next time, my friends, we'll see you later.